Hey guys, let's talk about Tic Tac Toe method for reading ABGs. So reading ABGs may be important in field medicine. They should be important in field medicine. They paint a good picture of what's going on with your patient. In many cases, most service, I think you'll see as technology becomes more prevalent, you'll see more and more point of care labs being performed out in the field. So let's get down to it pretty quick. Let's go over a few ABG values real quick, just so we know some baselines before we learn the tic-tac-toe method. Now, I'm going to assume you already have an understanding of respiratory and how acid base works. If not, I'm going to be creating some other videos explaining acid base and going over at least my perspective on how uh, I like to teach it. So let's go over some things, make some notes here for some ABGs. pH, normal range for pH. Your PaO2, your partial pressure of oxygen, is going to be between 80 and 100 millimeters of mercury. Your PCO2, your partial pressure of we're going to use in the tic-tac-toe method. Your bicarb, which is your metabolic component, your HCO3, that's going to be between 22 and 26 milliequivalents per liter. Now, some books may say 22, 28. Most books are going to tell you 22, 26, somewhere right in there. And then I threw a little footnote in here. So life exists between 6.8 and 7.8. That's the range of pH that human life functions within. Now, there are the rare cases where you might see a patient just a hair outside of that range and still clinging to life. But for most parts, when a patient crosses that barrier, they generally will die. And there's not a whole lot you can do about it. So our goal is to catch them before they cross that threshold and work them back into that normal pH range of 7.35 to 7.45. And you'll notice that, normal, perfectly balanced pH is 7.0. And we live in that 7.35 to 7.45 range. So we live in that alkalotic state. Because remember, high is alkalosis and low is acidosis. So remember, we live in a slightly alkalotic state. And if you'll notice that 7.8 to 6.8 range, we're a lot closer to that alkalotic range. There's not a whole lot of room up there for us to expand, but there's a lot more room in the acidotic level. Part of the reason for that is a lot of our body processes produce acids, hydrogen atoms. We're making lactic acid. So we're making a variety of things that are acidotic, and our body gets rid of them in a variety of ways, such as breathing them off, breathing the CO2 off, so forth. Let's balance and maintain our acid base, our pH. The one always working, and it's constantly flowing back and forth. And that's that carbonic acid system that works on a metabolic level in our bloodstream. It's constantly functioning to maintain a balance within our acid and base, such as taking extra bicarb and mixing it with water, making that carbonic acid and breaking it down into hydrogen and bicarb, two components that neutralize each other and allow for a balance so those components can be taken around our bloodstream without pushing us too far into the acid. Our body will mix those to make the carbonic acid and break it apart into CO2 and water. So that a balance, an equation can work both ways to constantly maintain a balance, and it never stops. And then our respiratory system, it kicks in within a few seconds to minutes to try to balance things out by blowing off. It can take hours in some cases to start moving fluids or filtering components that allow us to create a balance. So method to read ABGs and decipher what your patient is in, what their status is, and whether there's any kind of compensation going on or not, or at least have a general idea. So let's work a few problems. So the best way to do this is, so you draw a little tic-tac-toe board, a little whiteboard here to work with. We'll take the three components that we're looking at measuring: our pH, our PaCO2, our carbon dioxide, and our bicarb, our HCO3. and we'll put them where they belong, in what column they belong in, and then you just read the chart. That's all there is to it. So let's look at some examples. Let's look at a perfectly normal blood gas. So let's say you got a patient's pH is 7.39. So that's within that 7.35 to 7.45 range. That puts the pH here in the middle. And our PaCO2 is 44. That's still within that normal range. So the PaCO2 is going to be right here in the middle. And let's say they have a bicarb of 22. That's going to be within our normal range. So our HCO3 is going to be within the normal range too. So when all of your values line up in that normal column, those are normal gas. That patient is maintaining homeostasis normally. Their pH is being maintained normally. So let's look at something different when it's abnormal. So let's say we have a patient that has a pH of 7.57. Now that's going to be high outside of our range. So that's going to be over here on the base. So we put our pH over there. And let's say they have a PaCO2 of 22. That's going to be low. Remember, CO2 is an acid. So less acid is more alkalotic. More acid is more acidotic. So that's going to put that patient over here in that alkalotic category, that base category. And then let's say they have a bicarb of 17. So bicarb is a base. So more of the base is more alkalotic, less of the base is more acidotic. So that's going to put that patient right over here because there's not as much base as needed. So once we lay it out where all three components go on our little chart, all we have to do is read the chart. The pH tells us what our patient is. Well, it's over here in the alkalotic category. So our patient's alkalotic. Respiratory is in the same column. So we know respiratory is the blame. So we've got respiratory alkalosis. So then we want to look at compensation. If the person's trying to fix the problem, if their body's trying to compensate for it. And we look at that opposite component and see where it's sitting. And if it's sitting in the opposite category over here, then it's trying to compensate, because what happens is it'll move from that normal range to that compensatory range, which is opposite, and it'll compensate for as long as it can before it moves back. So if we see it over here working, trying to compensate for this, then what we would call this is partially compensated partially compensated respiratory alkalosis. We just read the chart. The reason it says partially compensated, the pH is over here. It's still abnormal. If the pH was normal and these things were different, then it'd be compensated. But we're not compensating. We're partially compensated. So it's partially compensated respiratory alkalosis. Let's do another one. Let's go with a pH of 7.55. Still a high pH range. So pH goes over here in the base side. And let's say we have a bicarb, or correction, a CO2 of 51. So our CO2 is high. That's a lot of excessive acid. It's above our 35 to 45 range. So our PaCO2 is going to go 38. That's an excessive amount of base. Just read the chart again. What is our patient? Our patient's still alkalotic. But who's to blame? Who's on that side? Well, the metabolic component. Our bicarb is over there. So this is a metabolic alkalosis. And we can see, because our respiratory is over here on the side in the acidotic range, it's opposite of the component causing the problem. It's trying to fix it. It's trying to compensate. So this would be partially compensated metabolic alkalosis. You just read the picture. Let's do a couple of more. Then our 7.35 to 7.45 range, that's going to put the pH over here in the acid level on the acidotic side. And let's say we have a CO2 of 28. So that's not as much CO2 as should normally be there. That's going to put it over here in the base side, because we don't have as much acid as we should. And then let's look at our bicarb. And our bicarb is a 12. So we have a lot less bicarb or base than we need. So that's going to put the bicarb over here on the acid side. So we look and we read our chart. We look and see what our patient is. Our patient's acidotic this time. Who's to blame for it? Who's over here on the same side? It's going to be our bicarb, our metabolic component. So we metabolic acid here. It's trying to compensate for the problem. The body is trying to fix it. Now understand something about compensation here. Let's say our PCO2 was right here in that normal range. We still had metabolic acidosis going on, but this tells us one of two things. Either this is just occurring and this hasn't moved to compensate yet. But remember, these compensatory mechanisms are very rapid. So this is going to be really, really early into compensatory mechanisms are failing. In other words, when the patient started becoming acidotic due to a metabolic problem, the respiratory system would shift over here. Your CO2 would shift over here to try to fix it. And it would try its best to fix it for as long as it could until that system failed. And when that system starts to fail or it can't keep up to where it ends up on the same side, and that's what would be referred to as a mixed gas. When both components are over here on the same side, that's a mixed gas. That means no compensation is occurring anymore. The body can't compensate. And now both of these components are adding to the problem. This is going to be a really sick patient. This is way later in the process where the body has failed to compensate. We really don't know which component started it or which component's the primary cause. We know they're both contributing to it. It's a mixed gas. And this is going to be one of those patients, when we see the mixed gas, we're behind the 8 ball. We're behind. And we need to work really hard to fix the problem with this patient. This is where your history and your other assessments and other lab work and all comes into play, where we can try to paint the picture of maybe being a diabetic, a metabolic problem, and a diabetic whose sugar is 800, or a septic patient. We've got an infection and we've got a source of infection and we've got positive sears and we're trying to figure out what the infection is. Turbated for too long, or a pneumonia patient. So we have to assess to try to figure out what started the problem and what's causing it. But we know this is going to be a sick patient that we really need to work on trying to fix the problem more aggressively. Let's do one more. So let's take a patient that's got a pH of 7.17. 7.17 is going to be to the acidotic side of our range. So the pH is going to go here. Let's say they have a CO2 of 48. CO2 is just a little high, but CO2 is an acid, so we got extra acid. We're going to be acidotic. So the PCO2 is going to be over here. And let's say their bicarb is 36. So that bicarb is a little high. We've got excessive base, so that's going to be more alkalotic. So our HCO3 is going to be over here. And then we just read the chart. What's our patient? Our patient's acidotic. They're in the acidotic column. So the patient's acidotic. We know the respiratory component's over here with them, so we know that's to blame. It's probably COPD or something, or someone with pneumonia. So we know we've got a respiratory cause, so it's respiratory acidosis. And we can see with our bicarb way over here that it's partially compensated. It's being compensated. So the body's trying to fix it. So partially compensated respiratory acidosis. You just read the chart. Write your 3 components down, read the chart. Practice it, and you'll get to where if you're putting the components in the right place, you won't misread ABGs ever again. It's pretty simple. Now let's go over one last thing. Let's say the pH turns out to be in the middle, but our other components are offsides. So this is a situation where we're fully compensated. The pH is in the normal range, and we know we have a problem with one of these, and the other one is trying to compensate. The other one's trying to fix the problem. So how do we figure out where our problem is coming from? Well, that's where we draw the 7.4 line right down the middle of our box and our normal box for pH. You take that 7.4 line, and we find out where the pH is sitting. If the pH is over here on this side of the line, the 7.4 to 7.45 side, then we look at what component is on that side, which in this case is our metabolic component, our bicarb. So we have a metabolic problem pulling that drift over here. If we can't fix this problem, that patient's going to drift over here. So we have a fully compensated metabolic alkalosis where the patient is being pulled into an alkalotic state. What if we're over here? Then we look at what's on this side of the board, what's causing what's pulling the patient this way, and that's going to be the respiratory. But we have a respiratory issue that's pulling that patient toward the acidotic side. So this is a fully compensated situation. It's probably really early in the process of what that compensation will fail. We can't compensate forever. So we need to try to address, we need to figure out where the problem is, which we can do with our ABGs, and then we need to try to address that problem, and the body pull itself back into the middle of those normal ABGs. Enjoy it. If you have any questions, just let me know. Have a good day.